Well, in his book, A Better Idea, Donald Peterson had some interesting insight into some of the challenges of leadership. Peterson was CEO of the Ford Motor Company during the decade of the 80s, and some of you might remember that their company came into sort of a crisis during that period. Well, after months of strategic meetings, the leadership of Ford decided that they had somehow, over time, lost sight of their original vision. They had become sidetracked and distracted along the way, and they had to go back to square one and say, what exactly are we in business to do? Why does the Ford Motor Company exist? And the book tells us how they returned to the basics. They crafted a mission statement, refocused on their purpose. In essence, they refashioned the whole company around their vision. This kind of thing happens a lot in organizations. Business management guru Peter Drucker says that it's human propensity to start with a clear purpose and then just to get it muddied up along the way. A mistake leaders make quite often is that they assume that the people they lead are on the same page they are. And that's not necessarily so. In fact, effective leaders know that you almost can't go over your vision and purpose as an organization too often. It's just so important that everybody's together, moving, rowing in the same direction, understanding clearly what they're all about, what they're trying to accomplish. And it's for that very reason that we're devoting 3 Sundays to our series, Our Core Values. The purpose of this series is simply to clarify who we are as a church, the biblical basis for our vision, and the key values that we uphold. And especially here, it's just a few weeks before we move into our new place. It's going to be much more visible than hidden back here. And probably new people will come, and we need to know who we are before we assimilate them into us, our church or whatever. Now, when we talk about values, we're simply talking about what matters around here. Values are the things that we hope will characterize us as a church. In fact, if you flip over your announcement sheet, we have on the back side of it all of our 12 core values. We're dividing this into three parts. Our upward focus, values that center around God. Our inward focus, values that pertain to us as a church family. And then our outward focus, values that center on reaching out to people beyond our 4 walls. Now, last week we looked at the core values that pertain to our upward focus. We said that we believe that our highest calling is to love, honor, and worship Jesus Christ. Second, we believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God and is His catalyst for transforming lives. We believe that excellence honors God, that He deserves for us to serve Him and give Him our best, a spirit of excellence. And number 4, we believe that full devotion to Christ and His cause should be the normal expectation for every believer. And again, I want to make it clear that we're under no delusion that we're better than other churches. We're simply trying to define and clarify the vision that we believe that God has given to our church. And of course, I want to point out that by the word church, I don't mean a church building or the church as an organization or the programs of the church. The church is people and the values and the vision that we hold in common. We are the Seeker Church. Well, with that in mind, we're going to look at our inward focus today, 4 values about how we relate to each other. Number 1, we believe that loving and honest relationships should permeate every aspect of church life. One of the most dynamic, powerful dynamics among the early Christians in that first church is just the genuine love they had for each other. I mean, they just radiated love, concern, support, togetherness. You might remember that time in Acts chapter 20 when Paul was concluding his work with a church he had helped start up in the city of Ephesus. And as he's preparing to leave, he's been there a couple of years. He got some of the leaders and the core people down by the seaport town of Miletus, and they're reminiscing about all the time they spent together, all they've gone through. And it says, just as Paul was about to board his ship, he and the people knelt down and they prayed together. And it says they all wept and embraced him. I mean, you get the idea that there were some people who really come to know each other and love each other. Unfortunately, loving relationships are not always present in churches. In fact, sometimes there's more gossip, backbiting, and criticism among church people than there is among unchurched people. You know, somebody gets their nose bent out of shape by somebody else in the church, and then they refuse to speak to each other. In some cases, haven't spoken to each other for years. They attend the same church. Or sometimes maybe someone in the church makes a big mistake, or they go through something in their personal life, with their marriage, or one of their kids or whatever, and they're put down, even ostracized by others in the church. You know what I'm talking about. Unchurched people know what I'm talking about, and that's what's caused more than a few of them to look at the church and say, they're all a bunch of phonies and hypocrites. Obviously, that's not what we want to happen around here, because it's the exact opposite of what the Bible says should characterize, Jesus' followers. In Ephesians 4, Paul says, get rid of all bitterness and anger and slander, and instead be kind and compassionate to one another. There's just no place for personal grudges in the church of Jesus. There's no place for ongoing hidden resentments. We believe that every relational interaction should be characterized by love and kindness. When parents drop off our kids at the classrooms they go to, that little exchange between the parents and the children's ministry workers should be warm and positive. When members of the music team get together to rehearse, that interaction should be loving and affirming. When believers just talk to each other, our tone of voice should communicate mutual care and sincere interest in the other person's life. Now, I think it's interesting that in how these different values that we're talking about take hold in an organization, in a sports team, in a company, in a church. How are they promoted? How do they become established? My opinion is quite often it happens as a result of certain people who sort of champion a particular value. For instance, around here, there are a lot of people who I think who have helped create an atmosphere of love and warmth and friendliness. For instance, Donna Lee, she's been doing it for about 30 years. Kathy Bronner, Lee Williams, Paul Blevins, Tina Shula, my wife, Jana Martin, despite the boots, Buddy Haney, Don Darnell, Linda Stewart, Mary Larison, and many others of you promote, just because of who you are, you promote an atmosphere of love and friendliness and acceptance. Now, there's another aspect of this first value, and that is we believe in loving and honest relationships. Honest as in genuine, as in dropping the facades and just being real with each other. Now, I don't know about you, but ever since I can remember, I have had a very strong distaste for superficial, surface-level relating, and especially any kind of deceit. What I want, and what I believe most of you want, is an environment around here where we don't feel like we have to keep up any pretenses. We don't have to put on any masks or any facades. We can just feel safe, to be real, to be transparent with each other. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but many Bible colleges and seminaries tell their young pastors, they warn them not to get real close to the people in their churches. I heard this. They say, in order to lead, you've got to keep a professional distance. And besides, they said, if you get involved personally, sooner or later, you'll get burned. So don't be too vulnerable, don't open up too much, or people will use it against you. And to be real honest, I've been hurt a few times by other Christians. You probably have. But I'm not going to allow those instances to cause me to withdraw and shield my heart and build up big walls around myself. It's just no way to live. I'm committed to being real and relating authentically. And if things go wrong, as they sometimes do, maybe there's a misunderstanding or a relational conflict of some time, I'm committed to following the words of Paul in Romans 12, to live in peace with everyone, to do my part to make relationships positive and authentic and caring. Now, as a little side note to this first of our 4 inwardly focused values, I want to point out some of the advantages and disadvantages of being a larger church as well as being part of a smaller church related to this point. For instance, a big church usually has more programs and activities. They usually have nicer facilities and usually better preaching or speaking and better music than a smaller church does. However, oftentimes larger churches have a hard time remaining personal. You might attend a church for years and never get to know or sometimes even meet the pastor. If you miss or just stop coming, probably no one will even notice. In a smaller church, there may not be as many programs and activities. The buildings or facilities probably aren't as nice or well equipped. The music, in our case, isn't a whole lot worse than a gigantic church. And the speaking, I don't know, that's always been a big question mark around here. But the most significant advantages of a smaller church come in the way of it being more personal. I mean, you have a pastor who actually knows everybody's names, and your kids' names, and what you do for a living, and what your garage code is. I have all this information, what you've been through, what you're currently going through. And not just me, but you have other people here who've gotten to know you, who have come to care about you. Now, sometimes people will look at a smaller church and they'll say, well, you know, you don't have this big children's deal, indoor play area, Xbox 360s everywhere for the kids, and that's true. But one of the trade-offs is that a smaller church can be like a church family, where not only do the teachers know your kids personally and know their names, but a lot of people. When your kids walk in the doors, people say, hey, Addie, how you doing? Or, hey, Eli, I heard it's your birthday. It's almost like going to a big family reunion every Sunday. And we, adults, are like the aunts and uncles and grandparents and so forth to the kids. Plus, very important, our church is fun, a fun and loving place. So your kids won't grow up thinking of God as boring and church as boring. They'll associate God and church with positive, loving, fun memories. So that's a high value around here. We believe that there should be love, genuine love, among all of us. The second core value pertains to our inward focus. We believe that the church should operate as a unified team of servants, each person making full use of their God-given spiritual gifts. I mentioned recently how one of the worst things that could have ever happened to the Church of Jesus Christ took place about 1,700 years ago, when nearly all the work of the ministry, like they were doing in the early church, was taken out of the hands of what they call lay people and entrusted only to the clergy and to priests. Clergy and priests did everything. But that was never God's design for the church. And in Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians 12, and many other passages, it makes it clear that all believers have been called and all believers have been gifted to serve God, to serve the cause of Christ in some significant capacity or another. However, speaking for myself, I went to a good Bible-believing church for the first 21 years of my life, and yet I was totally unfamiliar with the concept of spiritual gifts. And so when I moved to Norman as a 22-year-old youth pastor, part of what I did is I tried to stand before a group of high school and junior high kids and teach them the Bible. And when I would stand there and talk, an amazing thing happened. They actually listened. Kids never listen in church, right? I remember my days as a junior high and high school kid. Our goal was to chew up and spit out every Sunday school teacher or youth sponsor they could talk into trying to work with us, right? It was like throwing them to the sharks. I feel kind of bad about that to this day. But I was speaking, and these kids were actually listening. And it seemed like I was getting through to some of them. And their lives were beginning to change over the weeks and over the months. For instance, I remember one time I did a little talk about getting along with your parents. What God in the Bible has to say about honoring your parents, regardless of your situation at home, stepmoms, this, that, whatever it is, try to honor and obey your parents. And I gave a real challenging message about being cooperative and respectful at home. Well, a few days later, I got a phone call, and it was a woman's voice, and she said, is this the person who's been teaching over at that high school youth group? I said, well, why do you ask? He said, well, I want to speak to whoever's in charge over there. What would you like to speak to that individual about? She said, well, there's been this dramatic change in the life of our son. He's been so cooperative around the house, and just this tremendous positive shift in his attitude. Yeah, this is the right person. You got it. The long and short of it is that when I would do these little talks, kids would listen, and they would bring their friends, and many of them would respond to what they were hearing from the scriptures, and their lives were changed. It wasn't until some time later that I discovered that God had given me the spiritual gift of teaching, which is ironic since I was a terrible student in school and never listened to the teachers, but of communicating the truths of the Bible in a way that most people could understand it. And if you are a believer, God has given you one or more spiritual gifts, the ability or the talent to do something in the church or to advance the cause of Christ. You've been gifted to do some things I can't do. That has become very apparent as we're working on the building down there. Some of you can do things I have no ability in, and maybe God's gifted me to do some things that all of you can't do, but when we all pool our gifts, when we all pitch in and do our God-given part, then the church functions just the way God designed it to. And we're a unified team because every person, every role, in one way or another, helps to fulfill our mission and helps us to live out our values. And we're a unified team of servants because no gift, no person is more esteemed or should be less esteemed than any other. Some of us have more visible roles that we play. Others are behind the scenes, but every gift, every person matters equally. Also, serving is a huge key to spiritual growth. It's based on what you might call the sponge principle. Sponges are made in such a way that they absorb, they take in until they're full. And once they're full, they can't absorb or take in anymore until what? They're squeezed out. It needs to be empty before it becomes useful again. The sponge principle is that Christians who don't serve God and others but are expecting to continually be absorbing, taking in, will wind up very frustrated. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus put it clearly, give and it will be given to you. Notice the order. Being a taker only, this doesn't work. Well, not that millions of Christians are trying it, but it does not and simply cannot produce significant spiritual growth. However, those who understand and live by the sponge principle, taking in, giving out, taking in, giving out, they experience true spiritual growth and maturity. And when a bunch of them do that together, really great things can happen. So inward core value number 2, we believe that God designed the church to function most optimally when we operate as a united team with each person's having a servant's heart and each person's role being esteemed by everybody else. Well, the third value we're going to look at is we believe that community happens best in the context of smaller groups. Now, there's a sense of community when we gather here on Sunday, that we're a church family and we care about each other. But the practical functioning of community happens best in the context of that are more intimate than this. Maybe you're familiar with the one another's that help build community. There are 48 one another's in the New Testament. 48 one another commands like love one another, serve one another, be devoted to one another, pray for one another, care for one another. There are 48 of those. But it's just not that feasible to try and practice most of those one another's in a crowd like this. This is just not the best setting or situation. But when you've got some people, a smaller group of people who really get to know each other over a period of time, well, then they really can pray. They really can be there for each other. Huh? Everything okay? All right. Community is when Christians decide to go beyond surface level relationships to genuinely caring about each other, to getting to really know each other. Community is when someone is going through a serious crisis or difficulty in their life, and the other believers, they pitch in. They help. They care. They help, carry the burden. They offer their concerns. So when people join one of our ministry teams, whether it be music or greeters or cafe or tech or children, one of the greatest benefits are some of the friendships that you develop with some of the people on that team. They'll get to know you, and you get to know them and what's going on in their life, and they get to know what's going on in your life. When you have a baby, they're going to show up at the hospital, and they're going to bring meals to you when someone in your family has had surgery or whatever. They're the people you can sit by at church or go to lunch afterwards if you want. And this idea of Christians living in community with each other comes straight out of the Bible. Started Jesus. He had a small group of 12 that he was really close to. As Jana read earlier in the book of Acts, early believers met in homes together, and they were just together, and they were friends. And the Apostle Paul surrounded himself with a faithful little band of brothers. And I want to commend all of you who are following that biblical example and challenge all of you who are not yet doing it to think about it, to initiate some things and make it happen for you. Well, the fourth core value that relates to our inward focus is we believe that diversity matters to God and therefore should be represented in all areas of church life. Check this out. In Acts chapter 17, It says, from one man, that is Adam, God created all the nations throughout the whole earth. Different countries, different cultures, different colors. That was God's idea. And it was a good thing. The diversity of the human race was a delight to the Creator. Red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in God's sight. You remember that. Galatians 3, this is an interesting verse where Paul talks about in the church. You are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus, for you were all united with Christ in baptism. For all of you who were united with Christ in baptism have been clothed with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Here Paul mentions three sort of categories, several things that have changed because of what Christ brings to us. One is racially, one is racially, Jew or Greek. Racial distinctions are to be unimportant in the church. You know, these verses refer to Jews and Greeks. Our context in Norman, Oklahoma would be more black and white or other ethnic groups in white. And then he talks about slave or free, sort of an economic, continuum. And then male or female. And back in this day, they actually believed there was a male and female back in this day, not, anyway, whatever. And so, whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whether they're this race or that race, whether they're young or old, it's saying that in God's design, people are equal. Now that dream may never be realized out in our world as a whole. That women matter as much as men and young people matter as much as old and all these different things. But God's desire is that at least in the church, these barriers, these things that divide would come down. Once people are Christians, their new spiritual identity takes precedence over their economic identity or their racial identity or their gender identity. They remain Jew, Gentile, black and white, rich, poor, whatever. But those are non-factors when it comes to their value and to their equal participation in the life of the church. That's what Paul was talking about. Now, maybe we can't make these things happen in our society at large, but we can teach and model these values to our kids. And we can do it as a church, to aspire to be the kind of church that models the unity and the harmony that Christ desires. Rich and poor, black and white, women and men, young and old. Well, I can't tell you how strongly I believe in these four core values. I hope you do too. Believe that loving and honest relationships should be what we're all about. Believe that we should operate as a unified team of servants. No one better than the other. We all just have our particular role that we play. We believe that community happens in a large group, but it happens better in smaller groups of people. And we believe that diversity matters to God and therefore should be represented in all facets of church life. Now, the purpose of this series is to paint a picture of what we want to be. We're not there yet, but we're on our way. What would you say is the largest living organism in the world today? How about the blue whale? Weighing in at 120 tons, over 80 feet long. Or maybe it's a giant sequoia tree. Many of you have been there, taken a picture just like that, standing over 300 feet tall, and the trunk measuring 30 feet in diameter. Or what about the aspen tree? I think, well, that can't be it. Well, the aspen rarely grows more than 100 feet tall, and its trunk is no more than a foot wide. The aspen has a hidden secret. A single tree rarely stands alone. Each aspen is interconnected to the others through its root system. In this way, an entire grove of aspen trees can be one living organism. In fact, a single interconnected root system can actually cover hundreds of acres of aspen trees. Well, the church, the way God designed it, has a little known secret. And its secret is found through interconnectedness. First, that each of us is connected to God. And then as we form genuine, loving, committed relationships, there's more interconnectedness, where it's not just one or a few trees trying to withstand a winter storm. You know, if I stood all by myself and tried to withstand a typhoon strength wind or a hurricane or a tornado, you know, it would be impossible. I'd be swept away. But, you know, if 100 of us stood together and locked arms with each other in a big interconnected mass, no strength of wind, no storm could ever knock us over. That's what these 4 core values today are about.